Good day, folks, and welcome to the Anorak Review Show with your host, the Anorak. Time to talk about Bowie again, and probably one of his more well-known albums. And hopefully this time, neither my phone, camera, or my laptop decide to just crash in between parts. After his previous albums, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps in 1980, David Bowie had been in a couple of musical collaborations and even a few film roles. That album would also prove to be his last with RCA Records, the label that had released his albums as far back as his fourth album, Hunky Dory, in 1971, and whom he felt a growing sense of dissatisfaction with. So with this, he signed up with EMI America Records, which would release his albums for the rest of the 80s up to the first Tin Machine album. And this album here would also be recorded within about 17 to 19 days and be co-produced by Nile Rodgers himself of Chic fame. Yes, that Nile Rodgers. And the album would soon prove to be a massive success back in 1983, peaking number one for many countries and selling over 10 million copies worldwide. So as you can imagine, this was quite a resurgence for David. However, he himself wasn't so fond of this in later years, or much of his 80s material for that matter, believing that he had to pander to his audience and even referring to it as his Phil Collins years. I guess then he would have to do a cameo in a Spielberg film and do the music for 2 Disney animated features. But even if he didn't look back on this with much fondness, if even any, does it still hold up after 40 years? Let's find out by jumping into David Bowie's 1983 album, Let's Dance. The cover it's alright, featuring presumably David himself in some kind of boxing uniform with gloves and everything. The overall artwork was done by Derek Boshier, a prominent figure in the British pop art scene in the 70s and 80s. I also like how his name is contrasted itself, at least in the styling, with the David name being small and flat, and then the Bowie name being big and wide, and I think slanted and asymmetrical too. And I don't exactly know what's with how they stylized that Let's Dance title. Are they like dance steps because it's called Let's Dance? I don't know. I'm sure someone will comment something about this and kind of explain it for me. But either way, good cover. We begin the album with Modern Love, as opposed to Postmodern Love, which tends to kind of deconstruct a bit much. Definitely one of the more catchy and memorable tracks on the album, if not a good chunk of Bowie's discography, and a good choice for an opener, with its funky guitars by both Nile Rodgers and the late Stevie Ray Vaughan, punchy drums by Omar Hakim, catchy keyboards by Robert Sabino, and of course, Bowie's instantly recognizable vocals and lyrics. I catch a paper boy, but things don't really change. So, is this about when Herbert and Chris Griffin met for the first time? Nah, actually, this song seems to draw a parallel between a relationship between man and woman and a relationship between man and God, the reluctance of getting into one or the other. This is especially made clear in the call and response style choruses, influenced by Little Richard, as Bowie goes on about how modern love walks beside him and on by, and then gets him to the church on time. I guess modern love makes you more prompt and punctual. Neat. Then said church on time terrifies him, makes him party, and puts his trust in God and man. Dear heaven, that's truly terrifying. I mean, not the whole putting trust in a deity and converting to religion thing, but the fact that it makes him party! Oh, the terror! However, even with this newfound faith in God and man, there's no confession, or religion, likely because they don't believe in modern love. So, as much as the music itself is seemingly peppy, lively, and upbeat, there's an underlying sense of confusion and questioning one's own commitments, how we should be careful as to what or who we may place our faiths in, like whether it be in a simple yet serious relationship with another individual or in an institutionalized and denominational religion, and how each of us could end up in a never ending cycle. It's quite a deep thought if you think about it. I also have to note the use of brass instruments in the song, like tenor saxophones and trumpets. It's an extra layer that adds to this already bright and groovy tune. A brilliant balance of classic big band soul and modern pop rock music. Pun very much intended, maybe. And that's why I think many people like this song in particular. Its catchy beat and melody aside, it itself is a perfect contrast, both pessimistic and optimistic. Next is China Girl, a cover of the song by Iggy Pop from his 1977 debut album The Idiot, which is interesting since both had known each other and were close friends. Bowie even produced the Idiot album and co-wrote the China Girl song. So it kind of makes sense that he too would do his own version of it. While the original version had this raw, unpolished 70s pseudo-punk art rock sound to it, this version has a more 80s new wave rock kind of sound with a little bit of a Hong Kong garden vibe to it. Fittingly, I guess. If it weren't for the lyrics, you likely wouldn't think that they were even the same song at all. Now, whether which one is better than the other, I'll leave to your opinion, but said lyrics seem to remain at least mostly the same. It deals with the singer having a close romantic or even a sexual feeling with his China Girl, wanting to stay and be with her, but fearing that he could ruin everything she is, that he could end up getting her weakened and dumbed down by the society of which that he comes from. One line that sticks out to me is, "I stumble into town like a sacred cow." This could likely be reflecting Iggy's and Bowie's celebrity statuses at the time, which might have made them feel a little less human. Speaking of being inhuman, another line to note is, "Visions of swastikas in my head." Now, I don't think I need to tell or remind anyone on what swastikas represent in the Western world. However, I will say that in the Eastern world, mainly in religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism, it would have been a more positive symbol, whether facing left or right, representing things like luck and prosperity, etc. And ironically or not, all those religions believed in non-violence. And surprisingly or not, it has been around for millennia, long before it got culturally appropriated in the early 20th century by some really nasty people in history. After all, true evil cannot truly create. It can only either destroy or corrupt. And I believe that's the internal thematic conflict within this track. This modern love being threatened by past sins of hatred and cruelty, and our singer here is openly lamenting such paranoia, such fears and feelings, and is soon hushed by this China Girl, as if telling him to not dwell so much on these evils from long ago, these inner demons of his. However, all that said, in an alternative interpretation, China or China Girl is often used as a slang for heroine or China Cat. If people remember that Rise of Arsenal miniseries that Linkara reviewed over a decade ago. China Girl is an interesting song from the minds of two musical talents. But as long as you're careful, though, so you better hold it like China. Afterwards is the title song and pretty much the most well-known of such, Let's Dance. The 7.5 minute piece, yes, the album version is that long, would have definitely put Bowie back on the map for the new decade proper. No doubt inspiring a new generation of fans. And between Bowie's rocky songwriting and Nile Rodgers' funky production, it's also practically a matchup made nowhere else but in heaven. Quite frankly, the best of both individuals and both worlds. From the rising vocal intro that may call to some minds of Twist and Shout by the Beatles, to the simple and straightforward chorus of, well, let's dance, let's sway, every moment in this track is just as memorable as the last. Speaking of which, the lyrics themselves are fairly, well, simple and straightforward. One line being, put on your red shoes and dance the blues. Kinda cleverly using the contrast of colours, even though the actual opposites of red and blue are actually cyan and yellow, respectively. Though to be fair though, I'm sure Bowie can make yellow shoes look cool. Then there's the bridge slash pre-chorus bits in which he sings, if you say run, I'll run with you, and if you say hide, we'll hide. And if you seek, he'll probably say that you misunderstood how hide and seek works. Because of my love for you would break my heart in two if you should fall into my arms and tremble like a flower. This could be referring to how the very ideas of being in love or having such feelings are enough to make him all emotional, even if they're reciprocated or not. Although I honestly don't know what kind of flower would tremble. A trembleweed, perhaps? Anyway, another key element that makes this song so memorable and classic is its combination of 80s new wave synth-pop with some classic funky soul vibe, especially with, well, the use of trumpets and saxophones like in Modern Love, and even using a few wood blocks as well. Does anyone actually remember those kind of instruments? I certainly do in my primary school years. And with a pop song of this kind of length, there are bound to be a few instrumental bits here and there. And it certainly does, especially in between the choruses and near the end, where the guitars and saxophones really shine through. Let's Dance reminds me of the song. What song? The song with the power. What power? Power of voodoo. Voodoo? You do. Do what? Remind me of the song Dance Magic Dance. There, I've got that labyrinth joke out the way, let's move on. Side 1 ends as we go from the longest track to the shortest, Without You. Now, this song may either be underrated to some people or easily forgotten, especially going off so soon after such a high bar like Let's Dance. As for me personally, I think it's pretty fine. It seems to harken back to Bowie's old material in the late 60s and early 70s, not exactly in style or genre, but rather in the general approach of making such shorter, simpler, and more straightforward songs. Not just with its music, but also its lyrics as well. Just when I'm ready to throw in my hand, just when the best things in life are gone. And then I remember that they made a new Spider-Verse movie and a new Transformers movie. My life has found new meaning and purpose again. I look into your eyes, and I think you should really need to see an optician. I'm getting a little bit worried about that blood vessel in your eye. There's no smoke without fire. Well, technically there could maybe be smoke without fire, such as electronic cigarettes like vaping and stuff, but I'm no scientist. That's why we have Dr. Insano and Dr. Terawatt for. You're exactly who I want to be with. Without you, what would I do? Well, you could just get yourself a nice tub of ice cream, sit back, and mostly watch Nickelodeon. At least that's part of how I coped. And when I'm willing to call it a day, just when I won't take another chance, I hold your hand. And then I remembered the pandemic was still going on, so I pulled back my hat and scrubbed them in a heavy dose of sanitizer. Okay, all those jokes aside, this is a pretty okay song from Bowie, even if it may not stand out in most people's minds, but it can serve as a little palate cleanser and a more chilled track after the one preceding it. And being a very short song, it kind of ends quite soon as well. You'd almost miss it if you weren't paying attention. But on a plus, however, it also features a bass guitar played by close friend of Niall and fellow Cheek member Bernard Edwards. So there's some interesting trivia to know about this track here.